Excellent. Thank you for that, and I'll definitely let you know when to change. Thank you guys again, not only for your time today, but we're going to talk a little bit today with the ethical implications of behavioral psychology and continuous evaluation. So, interdisciplinary approach to where we examine the psychological, legal, and operational dimensions of the program, and some policy recommendations, legal discussion, literature discussion, to make sure that our national security efforts remain, aligned with our democratic values and human rights. And I really that really resonated with what Vince was saying about, a little bit more of the democratic values and human rights and the things that we were talking about earlier. So to understand, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so to understand, you have to understand this in context, specifically with continuous evaluation and insider threats. As we see, in literature, that our insider threats are becoming more subtle and more dangerous inside of the IC. Our traditional methods that we use for security clearance investigations and reinvestigations were no longer sufficient to detect, those patterns and nuanced behaviors of the potential for insider threats, which is where CE came into play. And of course, CE being real time and data driven, is a platform that monitors personnel for those types of risks. So with the implementation of CE, it really represented a paradigm shift in certain security practices, moving from a reactive to proactive monitoring, but also the shift from the traditional way to CE caused, it introduced a good amount of significant ethical concerns when predictive behavioral analytics, which are being used to assess psychological traits and behaviors. Let's move to the next slide. Sorry, it's a little post nasal. I apologize. So, with predictive behavioral analytics in CE, we're going to dive down into the predictive analytics within the CE systems, and this is where behavioral psychology enables these systems to be able to proactively detect the threats through analyzing things like stress indicators, personality traits, and even things like emotional cues. And these models that are used, that are described actually, that are used, they ingest digital footprints, social interactions, behavioral patterns to generate a risk assessment. But even though these predictive capabilities allow for early intervention, it raises a significant concern, especially when I was taking a look at this, when we consider both the psychological and ethical dimensions. But we'll also have to start with how these models really work, particularly in CE systems that use behavioral data to build profiles that estimate risk. So that one, we'll kind of hang that on the back of our mind a little bit. But in the literature, we have where there's a convergence of the utility of these models, specifically two scholars, Caputo and Hussein, as well as Russo and Torres. There's rich argument in convergence where that predictive analytics allow security professionals to intervene before a threat materializes. So, with that discussion, it's really seen as a proactive approach to see. It's seen as a major advancement over traditional reinvestigation cycles, which miss those subtle behavioral shifts. But on the other side of that, there's also divergence in the literature where there is ethical and psychological implications where they diverge sharply, particularly in two cases, in Jimeni and actually in the American Psychological Association, a recent one that was put out in 2025, where there's this not only caution to the wind, but almost like a warning or a beacon that the models are inherently probabilistic and they are prone to misclassification. So, without human context, the algorithms may misinterpret benign behaviors like emotional withdrawal due to grief emotional withdrawal due to stress, and perceiving those as a threat or a flag. And really, in those two divergences, you see that it leads to false positives, reputational harm, and additional psychological distress. And really, from a theoretical standpoint, when you back up a little bit to attribution theory, it becomes really relevant when you paint in the details, because attribution theory informs and explains how individuals interpret the causes of behaviors, whether they're internal traits or external circumstances. And predictive models in CE lack that fine nuance um, to distinguish between the causes leading to flawed assessments. So, on another note as well, cognitive appraisal theory, which also states that emotional responses are shaped by individual interpretations of events. It's leads to the understanding with the divergence of literature that the behavioral data alone cannot fully capture psychological state of mind or the psychological state of that current individual. The second point where it diverges in the literature is that there's concerns of psychological linguistics, linguistic analysis in sentiment direction, but the tools can identify the emotional states and shifts of tone, but they can also, there's a high risk. I don't want to say high. I'm just going to say that there's a risk of the models oversimplifying human expression. So there's instances that we're all familiar with sarcasm, even cultural idioms or emotional suppression that are misread by algorithms. It leads, that misreading leads to inaccurate conclusions. And Bird in 2023 also emphasizes the needs for explainability and validation in those models. Warning in the literature, there was a real warning that popped out that without transparency, predictive analytics can fail to meet the ethical standard or the ethical baseline. So let's go to the next slide, please. Yes, I'm going to preclude this one and then we'll go into that. So with that, to address those concerns, the literature continues to really call for an increase in ethical oversight as well as transparency in the algorithms and the continued integration of human judgment into the CE systems. And there's also the growing consensus that predictive analytics must be guided by scientific rigor, and ethical governance. But really, that divergence on how much autonomy these systems should have and how much discretion should really be left to the human analysts. And the same thing as we go, through into the ethical concerns, and even from my paper discussion, with the literature in this, when we take a look at the ethical landscape surrounding predictive behavioral analytics, specifically in the case of continuous evaluation, the literature is really rich, but also with that richness comes division, and it's really a complex reflection of the tension between the technical innovations that we have with CE and the continued need to protect individual rights, and even to the extent of protecting psychological well-being for the individual. And even at the heart of that debate, that there's a rich ethical debate that the use of those probabilistic models in CE to assess human behavior, that's really where those models, while they're powerful, they're definitely prone to bias, and they lack transparency. The data sets that inform those models range everything from financial records to social media activity, to infer psychological traits and to predict future behavior. So in the discussions as well, there's also convergence that if those systems, if they're left unchecked, can lead to, again, misclassification, stigmatization, and as well as the erosion of trust. So without really rigorous validation and contextual interpretation, rather, these systems may disproportionately flag individuals based on things like as simple as race, gender, and even socioeconomic status. So where those convergences happen, there's also divergence as well in the ethical permissibility place of where the use of psychological data inside of predictive and that analytics occur. This debate of whether or not that any attempt to quantify or predict human behavior in a high stakes environment, even like the IC, is riddled inherently, and it's probably inherently problematic. Um, the citations, the sources in literature, they argue about autonomy and consent, as well as the potential for psychological harm, and those are really grounded in deontological ethics, as well as the prioritization and the protection of individual rights over ones that would be utilitarian outcomes. So, can we move to the next slide? Let me make sure I'm moving on task here. Let's stay back on the previous one. Sorry about that. My apologies. But the also with the advocacy of, hold on, let me back up. I just had a brain freeze. With the where the literature also is informing us is that there is also a consequentialist view. So that is where we see this rich argument suggesting that things like predictive behavior analytics are ethically justified if they prevent harm and protect national security. And these scholars really come together to advocate for the development of robust, we'll say, oversight mechanisms and transparency protocols, as well as ethical review boards to mitigate those types of risks. With the right safeguards in literature, it's the CE systems can be more effective and ethically sound. And at the same time, psychological theory also informs that debate. It helps kind of paint in the lines or color in the picture for us. In social identity theory, we see, for example, we highlight how surveillance can affect group dynamics and individual self-concept. When individuals specifically feel they're being unfairly monitored or watched, we'll say, or singled out, it leads to the in-group, out-group tension, as well as I don't want to call it degradation of cohesion, but we'll call it a reduced organizational cohesion, if that makes sense. So with that, the CE systems still, they operate without clear communication or consent that undermines certain psychological needs, as well as leading to disengagement and even resistance. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So for the legal frameworks and oversight, as well, we'll take a look. There's legal frameworks that govern CE, as well as the backbone of how CE is authorized, implemented, regulated across the IC, and really at the core are the statutory and executive directives in EO 13467 and SEED 6, which they outline the operational standards for CE and the types of data that can be collected. Those types specifically are criminal records, financial records, financial anomalies, foreign travel, and even social media activities. And really, these legal instruments provide the legitimacy of CE, but it also raises significant concerns about privacy, significant concerns about due process and the scope of surveillance. Really, in the Privacy Act in 1974, when you really take a dive down into it with the CE lens, you take a look at the relevance, since it governs, the collection, maintenance, and dissemination of PII by each federal agency, and its mandate is pretty transparent as far as consent and the right to access the data. But CEs often, operate in ways that challenge those principles of the Privacy Act, especially when we take a look at behavioral data that is being inferred rather than being explicitly provided. In the literature, there's also convergence with a congressional research group in Burke and White that agree that national security operations have to be conducted within the bounds of constitutional protections. But there's also divergence of where the current legal frameworks are necessary or are sufficient already to address the complexities and things like the Privacy Act, and there's 5 USC 522 that offer, that state that there's adequate safeguards already and enforced. So, if with these safeguards, that if they're properly enforced in the literature, it wouldn't contend with the idea that the statutes are, that they are, quote unquote, designed now to handle the nuances of algorithmic decision making and psychological profiling, as an example. But really, from a legal theory perspective, it's really taking a look at, at the statutes and also that convergence and divergence of literature, where the ongoing debate is legally, it is specifically where there's emphasis in strict adherence to codified law. So with that, they may be legally authorized, but are they ethically justified? And that's still the ongoing debate, that where we see, gaps in oversight, where CE is subject to, things like internal review, but ODNI and even the PCLOB, the enforcement mechanisms are really limited. So there's still that growing call for independent review boards and reporting requirements and judicial oversight to ensure accountability. So there's a lot of richness to churn in that soil, in that area, especially in the legal front. But also, it's one of those questions: is how much is enough as well. Let's move on to the next slide. So the impacts on trust and mental health. This is a big one for individuals. We're all human beings participating in the intelligence community, as well as the CE program as part of our, ongoing background profession. And one of the profound areas that we see on individuals, we've even seen this, over time, but is how that feeling of constant surveillance really fosters a culture of suspicion, which leads to added stress and anxiety, as well as, in the worst cases, jobs had dissatisfaction, where those inferred traits are flagged by CE, but they're not concrete actions. So with those unintentional flaggings or intentional flaggings, it really erodes morale and undermines trust in the workforce. And the ethical management of the CE systems, it's essential to mitigate these harms, to foster a supportive IC, by promoting both transparency and fairness. But CE should become a tool that it not only protects security, but also upholds the psychological well-being, the health profile of personnel that are enrolled in it. The next slide, please. So some policy recommendations, based on those findings in review of the literature. There are some policy recommendations on the need, again, for ethical review boards that composed of, psychologists, even ethicists and legal scholars and civil liberty advocates, to mandate transparency in, that type of decision making where algorithms are involved, and also to promote the individual, the opportunity with the right to appeal. And those can come, those protocols can come from, psychological data governance that can be developed with individuals, like we had mentioned on one of the early slides, with the American Psychological Association's ethical standards, and that people that operate as analysts for CE receive adequate training in ethical decision making regarding mental health sensitivity, and making sure that the program is both ethically sound and that it's ethically effective. All right, next slide, please. And we'll take a look here too, at the psychological implications for those that are underneath of the CE umbrella, and really one of the most human-centered dimensions of the CE framework in totality, taking a look at this in extensive detail, there is a psychological toll of being under constant surveillance. This is not a theoretical. It's a deeply personal thing, and it's operationally significant. From a psychological standpoint, that CE environment or umbrella, it introduces that persistent state of hypervigilance, but it also uh, we also come to understand that it also aligns with things and principles in general adaptation syndrome, which describes how prolonged exposure to these types of stressors rather lead to exhaustion and really breakdown. And in the CE environment, it's not just a single, a one-time thing or a single event, and it's ongoing. It's an invisible presence of that surveillance, just ongoing over and over and over again. So, with the with that information in mind, we have to really balance the harms and benefits of the CE system with psychological resilience in mind of our workforce over the number of years, and that means really integrating not only mental health support but also ensuring the fairness of the algorithmic portion of this, and that clear channels exist for redress and also for the opportunity to appeal. But also it means for those, again, we had talked about a little bit about the training of the CE analysts to recognize the difference between behavior anomalies and psychological distress, and then be able to respond both with empathy and discretion. Next slide, please. There, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So we talked about the individual a little bit, and we're going to dive back into the harms and benefits to government as well for the CE system. That the consequences, the harms and benefits to the government, as far as CE it clearly offers an operational advantage, and they enable real-time detection of insider threats. Reduce resilience on outdated investigation cycles, and align with certain modern risk management risk management strategies, where we see in the era today that we have an increase. We're seeing sophisticated adversaries on the increase, as well as asymmetric threats, and CE does definitely provide a proactive mechanism to safeguard that information, sensitive information, as well as national security. And literature converges, in that as well, about the behavioral shifts, the financial irregularities, and the social patterns that definitely indicate risk. And the integration of behavioral analytics into the CE platform is a strategic enhancement because it allows agencies to respond both with agility and precision. But again, on the divergent side, we see that a lot of that items that come out of there is the benefits to operational security comes at the risk of the culture of suspicion and the feeling of being constantly scrutinized or even undervalued. Reduces employee performance, as well as increased turnover, and undermines the it undermines the very security that CE aims to protect. Okay, next slide. On this conclusion for future directions, of course, the CE program today, the CE programs offer significant potential regarding insider threats and detection for national security purposes, but it should not come at the expense of civil liberties and psychological well-being, specifically the cost of civil liberties and the cost of psychological well-being. With that, future research should really take a look at the long-term psychological impacts of CE, and continuing to examine not only internally here in the U.S., but also how other nations are balancing the security and ethics the security and ethics in similar programs that they would have maybe across the Five Eyes or for even 14 nations, and to see how they're balancing both ethics in in similar programs. So they may not call it CE, they may call it something else, or it may be a fragment or a compartment of multiple things. All right, and I think that comes to the end. The rest is all the references for all the interdisciplinary discussion. That's more than welcome for your reading pleasure. You're more than welcome to review any of those, and I appreciate the time.